The night was still and quiet, but a scream shattered the peace. It came from the house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a small, two-story home that had always been warm and inviting. But now, it was the scene of a nightmare. Inside, two twin sisters, Emily and Grace, lay in a pool of blood. Emily's eyes were wide open, her expression frozen in shock, while Grace's was twisted in pain, her life slipping away. But it was not just the gruesome sight that stunned the officers who arrived on the scene. It was the confusion. Grace had been murdered, but her twin sister, Emily, was standing there, clutching the bloody knife, her hands shaking violently. A neighbor, who had witnessed the entire thing, was calling the police. "They were always so close, so loving," she said through her tears. "What happened? Why would Emily do this?" No one had any answers, but the question echoed through the community. How could something so tragic happen between two sisters, especially twins who had been inseparable their entire lives? As the police began their investigation, the mystery grew. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery, no motive that anyone could easily identify. But one thing was clear: the family was hiding something. They weren't telling the whole truth, and that made the case even more puzzling. What had driven Emily to murder her sister? And why did their family seem so determined to cover it up? The mystery was just beginning. The story begins in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the Lambert family had lived for years. The twins, Emily and Grace, had always been the perfect pair. They looked alike, talked alike, and often finished each other's sentences. To outsiders, they were inseparable. But beneath the surface, their relationship was more complicated than anyone realized. Growing up in a home that emphasized perfection, the Lambert family was one of the more well-respected in the community. Their father, Daniel, was a successful lawyer, and their mother, Sarah, was an interior designer with a growing reputation. The girls were expected to excel in everything they did, from academics to extracurricular activities. And for a long time, they did just that. As children, they had always been close. But as they entered their teenage years, things began to change. Emily, the more outspoken twin, became more rebellious. Grace, on the other hand, was quieter, more introverted. Emily was the one who liked to push boundaries, sneak out at night, and talk back to their parents. Grace preferred staying home, reading books, and avoiding confrontation. Despite their differences, they still shared an unspoken bond, one that neither could explain but both felt deeply. But as they got older, something shifted. Emily began to distance herself, and Grace found herself drawn to her sister in a way that felt different. They started spending more time together, talking about things they had never discussed before. The lines between friendship and something more blurred, and neither of them knew how to handle it. At first, they kept their feelings secret, unsure of what was happening between them. But as the tension grew, so did the secrecy. The relationship was not without its complications. The twins had always been close, but now their connection was deeper and more intense. Emily became possessive, and Grace, though conflicted, found herself unable to pull away. The feelings they shared were undeniable, but it was a secret they could never tell anyone, especially their family. They were afraid of what their parents would think, the fear of rejection, of being labeled as something they weren't. And so, the secret continued to grow, becoming a silent weight that they carried together, alone. But secrets always have a way of coming to light, and theirs was no different. It started with Emily becoming more erratic. Her mood swings became more intense, and she became more secretive, often staying up late at night, pacing in her room. Grace was growing more concerned, but Emily would brush her off whenever she tried to ask what was going on. It wasn't until one late evening that things came to a head. Emily had stormed into Grace's room, her face flushed with anger. "You don't understand, Grace," she had yelled. "You don't understand what it's like to feel like this, to be torn between who I am and who I'm supposed to be." Grace had tried to calm her down, but Emily was inconsolable. "I don't know who I am anymore," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's real and what's just in my head." The conversation ended with Emily storming out of the room, leaving Grace sitting in stunned silence. She had no idea what was happening to her sister, but the fear in Emily's eyes was undeniable. Grace knew something had snapped, but she didn't know how to fix it. The next day, Emily was gone. She didn't come home that night. Sarah and Daniel were frantic, calling every friend and checking every place she could have gone. But Emily was nowhere to be found. Grace, for the first time, felt a deep sense of dread. She didn't know where her sister had gone or what had happened, but something told her it wasn't good. It wasn't until the next morning that Emily came back, but she wasn't alone. She had brought a new friend with her, a girl named Julia. Emily and Julia seemed inseparable, and Grace couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. She didn't know why, but she felt like her connection with Emily was slipping away, replaced by something darker and more dangerous. And then, the night of the murder happened. Grace had been alone at home, waiting for Emily to return. When she finally did, she found her sister in an unfamiliar mood. Emily was jittery, pacing the house, her eyes wide and frantic. Grace tried to talk to her, but Emily was distant, her mind somewhere else. It was then that the fight started. Words were exchanged, anger filled the air, and emotions ran high. Grace didn't know what had triggered it, but before she knew it, Emily had grabbed the kitchen knife. In a blur of confusion, the situation escalated, and within moments, Emily had plunged the knife into Grace's chest. As Grace fell to the floor, her breath quick and shallow, Emily stood over her, her face blank. The blood stained the floor, and the last thing Grace saw before the world went black was her twin sister, standing there, lifeless and cold. But what happened next? Why was Emily covered in blood? And how would the family handle the tragedy? The answers weren't clear. Yet, the sound of sirens grew louder and louder as the police arrived, their red and blue lights flashing across the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their windows, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding at the Lambert house. The doors were thrown open, and officers rushed inside, immediately confronting the horrific scene. Emily stood by her sister, shaking, her hands covered in blood. It didn't take long for the police to take action. Emily was arrested on the spot, but the questions were already swirling in everyone's mind. How could this happen? Why would Emily murder her own sister? Grace was rushed to the hospital, but there was little hope. The wound was severe. The knife had pierced deeply into her chest, and despite the medical team's best efforts, she passed away within hours. The death of Grace Lambert was not only tragic but left the entire community in shock. How could such a violent crime come from two girls who had always been so close? As the investigation began, the story took on an even darker turn. Emily wasn't talking. She had been silent since the moment she was arrested, not offering any explanation. She had no alibi, and no one knew exactly what had happened in those final moments. The police were left with only one person who could shed light on the events: Emily herself. The townspeople were in disbelief. Emily and Grace were twins, the closest of siblings. Everyone had seen them together, laughing, joking, and living seemingly perfect lives. It didn't make sense. As the officers continued their questioning, they discovered something chilling. There was no clear motive, no obvious reason for the attack. Emily's silence was deafening. Her family, too, seemed unusually tight-lipped. Emily's parents, Daniel and Sarah, had been devastated, but they were also strangely reserved when asked for statements. As the media began to swarm, the Lambert family's privacy seemed to shrink by the minute. Rumors circulated. Had there been a falling out between the twins? Was it a crime of passion? Had Emily snapped because of jealousy or something deeper? No one could figure it out. But one thing was clear. Something was wrong with this picture. The police had to dig deeper. They started by searching Emily's room, hoping to find clues. What they uncovered was unsettling. Beneath her bed, in a hidden compartment, they found a notebook. It was filled with strange entries, long, rambling thoughts that hinted at confusion, distress, and fear. It seemed Emily had been struggling with her own identity for some time. Her words spoke of feeling trapped, of not knowing who she really was, of being consumed by feelings she couldn't control. There were also mentions of Grace, but not in the loving way one might expect. Emily had written about feeling an overwhelming sense of competition, as if Grace was the better twin, the more accepted one, the one who had it all together. The notebook painted a picture of a young woman who was unraveling, someone who had been carrying a heavy burden, a burden that had only worsened as time passed. Emily's confusion about herself had festered, and it seemed as though the tension between the twins had finally reached a boiling point. But that still didn't explain why Emily had chosen to kill her sister. The notebook didn't provide any answers to that question. It was just a collection of disjointed thoughts that didn't add up to a clear motive. And so, the investigation continued. Meanwhile, the Lambert family's attempts to cover up the truth were becoming more apparent. Sarah, Emily's mother, had been seen talking to the police several times, trying to steer the investigation away from certain details. There were whispers that Daniel, the father, was speaking to high-powered attorneys, attempting to protect his family from the public eye. It was clear they were hiding something that no one could quite put their finger on. The question now was whether the truth would ever come to light. Would the police uncover what had truly happened in that house? And if they did, would anyone be ready to face the full extent of the tragedy? As the investigation continued, the truth seemed to slip further and further away. The family's secrets, their quiet attempts to hide the details of that night, were making things more complicated than they already were. It was as if there was a web of lies woven around the crime, each strand pulling in a different direction. But one thing was certain: Emily's silence was not going to last forever. Then, just as the investigation seemed to be slowing down, something unexpected happened. A new piece of evidence surfaced, a witness, someone who had been at the Lambert house the night of the murder. This witness had been too afraid to speak before, but now they were ready to come forward. The new witness, a young woman named Julia, was the same girl Emily had brought home just a few days before the murder. She had been at the house that night and had seen the whole thing unfold. But Julia's account didn't match up with what Emily had told the police. In a statement to the authorities, Julia revealed something shocking. She had been in the house when the fight broke out between the sisters, and she had seen what happened before the murder. She described Emily as being frantic, pacing the floor, while Grace tried to calm her down. The argument, according to Julia, had been about more than just jealousy. There had been a secret, one that the twins had been hiding for a long time. But Julia couldn't explain it all. And then, just when the police were starting to believe they might get closer to the truth, Julia's story took an unexpected turn. She claimed she had seen someone else at the house that night, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Who was this mysterious figure, and what role did they play in the tragedy? The police were left with even more questions than before. The investigation had just taken another twist, and now it seemed that the truth was even further out of reach than ever. Would they uncover the secrets behind the Lambert family's tragic story, or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain: things were about to get much more complicated. The news of Julia's statement spread quickly through the community. She had been the key witness, the one person who could potentially unravel the mystery of what happened the night of Grace's murder. But when Julia's story surfaced, it only raised more questions. The police had been expecting answers, not more confusion. Julia claimed to have seen someone else in the Lambert house, someone who hadn't been mentioned before. The figure was described as a man, someone Emily and Grace hadn't told anyone about. Who was he? Why had he been in the house that night? The police immediately took Julia's statement more seriously. If there was someone else involved in the crime, it could change everything. The authorities now had to figure out who this mysterious person was. Julia didn't have many details, but she described him as being tall, with dark hair, wearing a black hoodie. He had been hiding in the shadows during the argument between the sisters. Julia had only seen him briefly, and when she asked Emily about him later, Emily had acted strangely, refusing to talk about him. But why had Emily kept this a secret? Was she protecting him? Or was there something else going on? The more they dug into Julia's testimony, the more inconsistencies emerged. It seemed that the story Julia was telling didn't add up with the other evidence they had. Emily had been arrested, and she had not mentioned anyone else being involved in the attack. But if Julia was telling the truth, then everything changed. The possibility of a third party was now on the table. The police decided to launch a new investigation into who the mysterious man might be and what his connection was to Emily and Grace. The Lambert family, meanwhile, was becoming more and more closed off. Daniel and Sarah Lambert, the parents of the twins, refused to speak to the media. They remained tight-lipped about the investigation, offering no explanation for the recent revelations. To the outside world, they were grieving, but their behavior seemed odd. They weren't cooperating with the authorities as fully as they should have been, and they seemed increasingly protective of Emily, even though she had been arrested for murder. As the investigation continued, the police discovered something chilling. Emily's phone had been wiped clean. All of her messages, her photos, and any trace of communication she had with this mysterious man were gone. It looked like someone had intentionally deleted everything, as though they were trying to erase any evidence of the man's involvement. Was it Emily who did this? Or was there someone else trying to cover their tracks? Detective Harris, the lead investigator on the case, wasn't ready to make any conclusions yet, but he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something wasn't right. The more he learned, the more he suspected that the Lambert family knew more than they were letting on. The story didn't fit together like a normal case. There were too many pieces missing, too many things left unexplained. And then, the breakthrough came. One evening, Detective Harris received a call that would change everything. A local man named Brian, who lived just a few blocks away from the Lambert house, had come forward. He claimed to have seen the mysterious man Julia described on the night of the murder. Brian didn't know his name, but he remembered seeing him leave the Lambert house just hours before the police arrived. Brian had been walking his dog, and as he passed by, he noticed the man standing near the back of the house, peering through the windows. Brian described the man as being about 6 feet tall, wearing a black hoodie, and acting strangely, almost as though he was trying to avoid being seen. Brian didn't think much of it at the time, but when he heard about the murder, he immediately realized he might have witnessed something important. He had even jotted down the man's description in his phone, just in case the police ever needed it. Detective Harris arranged for Brian to meet with him and provide a formal statement. As Brian recounted the night, the detective took careful notes. The man Brian described matched Julia's account almost exactly, but the question remained. Who was he, and why had he been outside the Lambert house? The police had to find out. The investigation was now at a standstill. The police knew there was someone else involved, but they didn't know who he was or what his role had been. And then, just when the situation seemed like it couldn't get more complicated, a new piece of information surfaced. A source from within the Lambert family, who wished to remain anonymous, came forward with a shocking revelation. This source claimed that the man Brian and Julia had seen outside the house wasn't a stranger at all. He was someone who had been close to the Lambert family for years. In fact, he had been living with them for a time. The man's name was Jake, and he had once been a close friend of Daniel Lambert. Jake had known the family for years, but he had disappeared from their lives shortly before Grace's death. The family had never mentioned him in any of their public statements, and none of the neighbors had seen him in years. But according to the anonymous source, Jake had been living in the Lambert house before the murder, and he and Emily had developed a close relationship, one that the family had tried to keep hidden. Now everything seemed to be falling into place, but it raised even more questions. Why had Jake been living with the Lamberts? What kind of relationship did he have with Emily? And why had the family kept him a secret? The investigation was now deeper than ever, and Detective Harris knew they were getting closer to the truth. But the more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation seemed to become. Whoever Jake was, he was tied to the Lambert family in a way no one had expected. And Emily? She was still refusing to speak, her silence now more unsettling than ever. The case was spiraling out of control, and with every new piece of evidence, it became harder to tell who could be trusted. The Lambert family had secrets, and those secrets were starting to unravel. But were they the key to solving the murder? Or was there something even darker lurking beneath the surface? And then, in the midst of the growing tension, the police received a tip-off that would change the entire course of the investigation. Jake was back in town. Where had he been? What was his role in all of this? And could the truth finally be uncovered before it was too late? The mystery was far from over. Jake's sudden return to town sent a wave of shock through the investigation. Detective Harris was certain that Jake held the key to unlocking the dark puzzle surrounding the Lambert family. The more he learned about him, the more questions arose. Why had Jake left so suddenly years ago? And why had he returned now, right after Grace's tragic death? What was his connection to Emily, and what did he know about the night of the murder? The police had little time to waste. Harris quickly ordered a search for Jake, suspecting that he may be trying to avoid the authorities. They knew he had been in contact with the Lambert family at some point, but he had disappeared without a trace. No one had seen or heard from him since his abrupt departure. Now, with him back in town, Harris couldn't afford to waste any more time. He needed to find Jake, and he needed to find him fast. Meanwhile, Emily remained silent. Her family, though devastated, was still offering no answers. Sarah and Daniel Lambert were sticking to their story, that they didn't know where Jake had gone or why he had reappeared. They claimed that they hadn't seen him in years, and that any connection he had to the tragedy was unfounded. But Harris wasn't buying it. He had seen families try to cover up secrets before, and he knew that something was off with the Lambert story. There was too much silence, too many strange gaps in their account of events. They weren't telling the whole truth, and Emily's growing isolation only made the situation even more suspicious. Jake had been living with the family for a period before he vanished, but the specifics remained unclear. He had been close to Daniel, often seen with him at family gatherings and parties, but he wasn't exactly a permanent member of the household. Jake had drifted in and out of the Lambert family's life. But now, with his sudden reappearance, the police had to figure out why. What role had Jake played in the family's dynamic? Was he more than just a friend of the family? And why was Emily so adamant about keeping him a secret? The investigation hit a standstill when the police couldn't find any trace of Jake. No one had seen him in the last few days, despite multiple search attempts. It was as though he had vanished once again. But as they scoured the town, one piece of information led them to a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a man matching Jake's description late at night, sneaking into the building and disappearing without a word. The police wasted no time. Harris and his team arrived at the apartment complex, determined to confront Jake and finally get some answers. The building was quiet, darkened by the late hour, but the air was thick with tension. Harris's heart raced as they approached the door to Jake's apartment. The neighbor's description had been accurate. The door was slightly ajar, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from within. The officers slowly pushed the door open, entering with caution. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with a few pieces of old furniture and piles of discarded papers scattered around. At first, the apartment seemed empty, but then they heard a rustling from the back room. Harris signaled to his team, and they moved swiftly toward the source of the sound. As they turned the corner, they found Jake standing there, his back against the wall, his hands raised in surrender. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Jake said, his voice calm, almost resigned. Harris didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We need to talk about the Lamberts. About Emily. About what happened to Grace." Jake's eyes flickered with something that was hard to read. Anger, fear, or maybe even guilt. But he didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stood there, his expression unreadable, as if weighing his options. The police officers stood by, waiting for him to make a move. "What do you know about the night Grace died?" Harris pressed, his voice steady but firm. Jake finally spoke, but his words were cryptic. "I don't know if I should be talking to you at all. You won't believe me anyway." Harris was growing impatient. "We'll believe whatever the truth is. But you need to tell us everything you know. About Emily. About the murder." Jake hesitated, his eyes darting around the room. Then, after a long pause, he sighed and dropped his hands to his sides. "Fine," he muttered, almost to himself. "But you need to understand, there's more to this than just a fight between two sisters." Harris's heart skipped a beat. This was the break they needed. "Go on," he said, his voice urgent. Jake stepped forward, his gaze falling to the floor as if remembering something painful. "I was close to the family, especially Emily. We had a relationship, but it wasn't like what you think." He took a deep breath and continued. "It wasn't just a simple friendship. There were things between us, things that no one knew about, not even Grace." The statement struck Harris like a thunderbolt. Could Jake be confessing something he wasn't ready to admit? Did it mean Emily had been hiding more than just a secret friendship with him? Was there something far darker going on between Emily and Jake that the family had been trying to cover up? "Emily and we were involved in something," Jake continued, his voice low and strained. something I shouldn't have let happen. And Grace. Grace found out. Harris felt a cold chill run down his spine. What do you mean, she found out? Jake's eyes filled with guilt. Grace wasn't blind. She knew something was off between Emily and me. She started asking questions, getting too close to the truth. And when she did, things started to unravel. Emily. She started to lose control. Emily's fragile mental state, combined with Jake's presence in her life, seemed like the missing pieces of the puzzle. Had their secret relationship driven Emily to the edge? Had Grace discovered it, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder? The detective pressed on. Did Emily kill Grace because of you? Because of what she found out? Jake flinched, clearly uncomfortable with the question. I don't know, but I know she was scared. Scared that Grace would tell everyone. That's why she snapped. Harris could feel the weight of Jake's words hanging in the air. The truth was finally beginning to surface, but it didn't make the case any clearer. In fact, it raised even more troubling questions. Was this truly a crime of passion, driven by fear and jealousy? Or was there something even darker going on within the Lambert family? As Harris left the apartment with Jake in tow, he couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation had just taken another, even more dangerous turn. They were closing in on the truth, but now, they were closer to unraveling a much deeper conspiracy. One that involved not just Emily and Jake, but the entire Lambert family. And with each new revelation, it seemed like the line between guilt and innocence was becoming harder to see. The tension in the air was palpable as Jake was taken into custody, and Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of uncovering something that would change everything. Jake's confession had opened a door to a deeper truth, but the pieces still didn't quite fit together. Why had Emily and Jake kept their relationship hidden for so long? Was it merely a love affair, or was there something more sinister at play? As Jake sat in the interrogation room, his eyes darting nervously around, Harris knew he had to dig deeper. The story was still incomplete, and the more he probed, the more he could sense Jake was holding back. Harris sat down across from him, his mind racing as he tried to find the right questions to ask. You said Emily was scared, Harris began, leaning forward, his voice low but commanding. Scared of what Grace might tell. But why did she snap? What pushed her to the point where she killed her own sister? Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Harris's gaze. It was as if the weight of the question was too much for him to bear. I don't know. I didn't want it to happen. But Emily, she felt trapped. She didn't want Grace to expose everything. It wasn't just about us. There were other things. Things I don't think anyone outside the family could understand. Harris's interest peaked. What do you mean, things outside the family? What could possibly be more dangerous than a secret relationship between you and Emily? Jake hesitated, his hands twitching as if he were about to break down. I don't know if I can explain it, but it wasn't just the relationship. Emily was carrying a burden, something dark, something that happened years ago. And Grace, she was the only one who ever got close to it. That's what scared Emily. The mention of a dark burden sent a chill down Harris's spine. Was there something in the Lambert family's past that had caused this tragedy to unfold? If Emily was hiding something, it wasn't just about her feelings for Jake. There was more, something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. Harris had to get to the bottom of it. I need you to tell me everything, Jake, Harris said firmly. What happened all those years ago? What did Emily hide? And how did Grace get caught in the middle of it? Jake's face twisted in anguish. For a moment, he remained silent, clearly wrestling with his thoughts. Then, as if giving in to the inevitable, he spoke. It all started with a secret, he began, his voice trembling. A secret that Emily couldn't bear anyone finding out. She and Grace, they weren't just sisters. They were tied to something darker, something in their past. Harris's mind raced. What are you talking about? What happened in their past? Jake swallowed hard, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Years ago, before they were even teenagers, there was an accident. It wasn't just any accident, it was a violent one. Emily and Grace were involved in something terrible, and it wasn't an accident at all. Harris leaned forward, his heart pounding. What kind of accident? What exactly happened? Jake paused, his eyes locking with Harris's. It was a fire. A house fire. And Emily, she was the one who started it. The words hung in the air, like an explosion waiting to happen. Harris felt the weight of Jake's revelation hit him all at once. A fire. And Emily had started it. Was this the dark secret that had driven her to murder her own sister? What had happened in the aftermath of the fire, and how had it been kept hidden for all these years? Why didn't anyone know about this? Harris asked, struggling to process the gravity of the situation. How could this have been kept a secret? Jake's expression hardened, and he looked down at his hands, clearly burdened by the guilt of what he was about to say. Because the Lambert family covered it up. They couldn't afford the public scandal. Daniel and Sarah, they made sure no one ever found out the truth. They erased the evidence. They paid off people. They did everything they could to keep the fire a secret. It was a mistake, something Emily didn't mean to do. But she couldn't live with the guilt. So this is what Grace found out? Harris asked, trying to make sense of it all. She discovered the truth about the fire? Jake nodded slowly. Yes, she found out, and she started to ask questions. Emily couldn't let that happen. She didn't want the whole family to be exposed. She was afraid Grace would ruin everything. She'd been hiding the fire for so long. And when Grace started digging into the past, Emily lost it. That's when everything went wrong. Harris sat back, trying to absorb the enormity of the confession. Emily's motive was becoming clearer now, but the question still remained. Did Emily kill her sister in a fit of rage, or was there something more premeditated about the crime? Jake's words seemed to suggest the former, but Harris wasn't so sure. He still didn't know if everything Jake was saying was the complete truth. One thing was certain, though. Emily had been hiding something far darker than anyone had imagined. The fire was only part of the story. Harris needed to know more. The Lambert family's secrets were beginning to unravel, but there was still a deep web of lies that needed to be untangled. Jake's confession had opened a door, but it wasn't enough to solve the case. Harris had to dig deeper, and the next step was to confront the Lambert family, specifically Daniel and Sarah. They had been protective of Emily from the very beginning, but now it was clear that they had been hiding the truth. Their involvement in the cover-up couldn't be ignored any longer. Later that evening, Harris visited the Lambert family's home again, this time with a sense of urgency. He wasn't leaving until he got the answers he needed. He rang the doorbell, and Sarah opened the door, her face pale as she saw the officer standing in front of her. "I need to speak with both of you," Harris said, his voice steady but firm. "It's time we talk about the fire. The one Emily started all those years ago." Sarah's face paled even further. Daniel, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, immediately stood up. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking with feigned disbelief. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about," Harris replied. It's time to stop hiding the truth. The silence between them was suffocating, and Harris knew that this conversation was about to take a dark turn. The truth was finally coming to the surface, and it seemed that no one, least of all the Lambert family, was prepared for the fallout. The air in the Lambert household was thick with tension as Detective Harris stood at the door, his gaze unwavering as he locked eyes with Sarah and Daniel. The couple's discomfort was palpable, and Harris could sense their unease. They had clearly been hiding something, but now the truth was on the verge of surfacing. The mention of the fire had sent a shudder through both of them, and Harris wasn't about to let them deflect any longer. "Sit down," Harris instructed, his voice calm but commanding. He stepped inside, gesturing toward the living room. "We need to talk." Sarah hesitated for a moment, exchanging a nervous glance with her husband, but then she nodded and slowly led Harris into the room. Daniel followed behind, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale. The couple sat stiffly on the couch, and Harris took a seat across from them, watching them closely as he spoke. "You know why I'm here," he began, his voice steady. "It's about the fire. The one Emily started all those years ago." Sarah's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly masked it with a look of disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaky. "That was a long time ago, Detective. There's no need to bring up such old stories." Harris didn't flinch. "Old stories? Sarah, we both know this isn't something that can be brushed under the rug. It's the reason Emily's life spiraled out of control, and it's the reason Grace is dead now. You and Daniel have been covering it up for years. But that stops today. Daniel shot to his feet, his face reddening. You have no idea what you're talking about, he shouted, his voice rising. You're accusing us of things we never did. You don't know what we've been through as a family. You have no right to come into our home and make these accusations. Harris remained calm, even though the tension in the room was rising. I don't need to accuse you of anything, Daniel. The facts speak for themselves. I know about the fire, and I know Emily's role in it. The question is, why have you kept it a secret for all these years? There was a long silence as Sarah and Daniel exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible look. Then, Sarah's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands in her lap. It was as if the weight of her guilt had become too much to bear. Emily was just a child, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't mean for it to happen. It was an accident. We thought we could control it, that we could keep it from ruining everything. We did what we had to do to protect her, and to protect our family. Harris leaned forward slightly. Protect her from what? From the truth? From the consequences of what she did. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of breaking down. You don't understand. We didn't want Emily's life to be ruined. The fire, it was a mistake. Emily was trying to do something good. She thought she could stop the damage, but she couldn't control it. It wasn't her fault. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low but forceful. The fire was an accident. Emily panicked. She didn't mean for it to get out of hand. But when it did, we couldn't just let her go down for it. She was a child, and we had to protect her. We made a choice. Harris's eyes narrowed. A choice? You chose to cover it up. You chose to erase the evidence. You chose to let Emily carry that guilt with her for all these years, and you thought you could bury it. But you didn't realize that eventually, the truth would come out. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We didn't know what else to do. We couldn't let the world know that our daughter was responsible for something so horrible. It would have destroyed her. It would have destroyed all of us. And now look at what it's cost you, Harris replied, his voice cold. Look at where we are now. Grace is dead. Emily is in jail. And you're still hiding behind your lies, refusing to face the truth. All this time, you thought you were protecting her. But all you've done is create a bigger mess. There was another long pause, and for the first time, Daniel looked defeated. He sank back down onto the couch, his hands resting on his knees. Sarah's expression was one of sorrow, but also of deep, overwhelming regret. We thought we could protect her, Sarah said softly. We thought we could protect both of them. But Grace, she kept pushing for the truth. She was never going to let it go. And when she found out, when she confronted Emily, everything changed. Harris leaned forward, eager to hear more. What happened when Grace found out? Sarah looked away, as though the memory was too painful to relive. Daniel spoke again, his voice strained with emotion. Grace started asking too many questions. She was determined to find out what happened, and when she did, she threatened to tell everyone. She said she was going to expose Emily for what she did, and we couldn't let that happen. Emily couldn't bear the thought of everyone knowing. She was already struggling with the guilt, and Grace, she was pushing her too hard. It became too much for Emily. Harris's mind was racing. He was piecing it together now. The fire wasn't just some tragic accident. It was the key to understanding everything that had led up to Grace's murder. Emily had been living with the weight of that secret for years, and when Grace found out, it was too much for her to handle. In a moment of desperation, she had snapped. And so you covered it up, Harris said, his voice quiet now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. You kept the secret, and when Grace threatened to expose it, Emily killed her to keep it hidden. There was a long silence. Neither Sarah nor Daniel responded. It was as if the truth had finally sunk in, and they could no longer deny it. But just as Harris was about to press for more details, something unexpected happened. A loud, urgent knock echoed from the front door. Everyone froze. The tension that had been building in the room suddenly shifted, and Harris's instincts flared. He knew this interruption wasn't a coincidence. I'll go check, Daniel muttered, standing up from the couch. Harris stood as well, his hand instinctively going to his holster. "Stay where you are," he ordered, his voice sharp. But Daniel had already moved toward the door. The tension was thick in the air, and whatever was on the other side of that door felt like it could change everything. When Daniel opened the door, Harris's heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway was Emily. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were wide with terror. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. And for the first time in this entire investigation, Harris wasn't sure what was coming next. The air in the Lambert household froze as Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Harris felt a wave of unease wash over him as she stepped inside, her body language frantic, her movements erratic. There was no denying it. Something was off. The quiet sorrow that had surrounded the room moments before had now shifted to something darker, more urgent. Emily's presence in the house was unexpected. She had been in police custody for several days, and no one had expected her to show up here. Her sudden reappearance was unsettling, and Harris instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between her and the Lambert family. "What are you doing here?" Harris demanded, his voice sharp and authoritative. "You need to be in custody." Emily's gaze flickered to the floor, her hands trembling at her sides. She was clearly disoriented, and Harris could tell she wasn't thinking clearly. But what was she here for? What was she trying to say? I need to tell you something," Emily stammered, her voice shaky. I need to make things right. I need to confess." Harris exchanged a glance with Daniel and Sarah. Neither of them had spoken since Emily had appeared, but their faces betrayed a mixture of fear and guilt. They hadn't expected her to come here either, and now, Harris realized, they weren't sure what to do with her. "Emily, you're in no condition to be here," Sarah said softly, her voice pleading. "You need to come with us. We'll get you the help you need." But Emily wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on Harris, and it was as if she could no longer hold back the truth that had been eating away at her for so long. She stepped closer, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "I did it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I killed Grace." The words struck Harris like a physical blow. For a moment, the world seemed to spin around him. He had been expecting this confession, of course, but hearing the words spoken so plainly, so matter-of-factly, sent a shockwave through the room. Emily had admitted to the murder, but something in her tone didn't sit right. There was no remorse, no clarity in her eyes. She looked as if she were trapped in her own guilt, but she wasn't the same person who had been sitting in jail just hours before. There was something else in her, something that didn't belong. "I need to know everything," Harris said, his voice steady but urgent. "What happened that night? Why did you kill Grace?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for a brief moment, she looked vulnerable, as if the weight of her confession was about to crush her. She sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together, and then she began to speak in a low, strained voice. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. I couldn't let her ruin everything. She found out about the fire, and she kept pushing me. She wouldn't stop asking questions. And I couldn't lose everything again." Harris's mind raced. He was piecing together the story he'd been investigating, but there was still so much left unexplained. What had happened during that confrontation with Grace? Was it really just a fit of rage, or was there more to the story? Emily's words seemed to suggest she was trying to justify her actions, but it wasn't clear if she understood the full extent of what had happened. Emily paused, taking a deep breath, her voice faltering. "I didn't mean to hurt her, but when I saw that look in her eyes, when she said she was going to expose everything, something inside me snapped. I couldn't let her tell anyone. I couldn't let them know the truth." Harris's pulse quickened. "What truth, Emily? What are you talking about?" Emily's gaze shifted to her parents. They both avoided her eyes, their expressions betraying their guilt. It was clear that they had been hiding something for years, something that had led to this point, to this terrible tragedy. "Grace knew about the fire," Emily whispered. "She found out about it all. The truth about what happened, about how I was responsible." There it was again, the fire. Harris had known it was central to the case, but Emily's words confirmed it in the most damning way. The fire wasn't just an accident, and Emily's role in it wasn't a simple mistake. She had been hiding the truth for years, living with the guilt, and now it had driven her to commit murder. I didn't want to kill her, Emily continued, her voice breaking. But when she came at me with those accusations, when she said she was going to tell everyone, I couldn't take it. I couldn't let her ruin everything. The room fell into a heavy silence. Harris's mind was racing, trying to piece together the details. There was still so much to understand, so much that didn't add up. How had the confrontation between the sisters gone so wrong? Had Emily planned to kill Grace, or had it truly been a crime of passion? Why did you come here, Emily? Harris asked, his voice steady, though a sense of dread hung over him. Why did you leave the station? Emily's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and determination. Because there's more. There's something else you don't know. Something that's been hidden. Something that changes everything. The words made Harris's blood run cold. What could be worse than the confession she had just made? What was this new truth that Emily seemed to be alluding to? Before Harris could press for more, the door suddenly opened with a loud bang, and a new figure stepped into the room. It was Jake. His face was flushed with panic, and he looked like he had been running. Emily, we need to go. Now, Jake said urgently, his voice filled with fear. Emily stood up, her face ashen. Jake, what are you talking about? Jake rushed to her side, grabbing her arm. They're coming for you. We don't have much time. You have to leave now. They know everything. Harris felt his stomach drop. Was someone else involved in this? Had they been covering up more than just Emily's crime? What was Jake's role in all of this? What do you mean, they know everything? Harris demanded, his hand reaching for his gun, instinctively preparing for a confrontation. Jake's eyes darted around the room, panic written all over his face. The family, there's something you don't know. Something far worse than you think. We need to go before it's too late. Emily's expression hardened. Jake, I need to tell him everything. He has to know the truth. Before Harris could respond, the front door slammed open again, and this time, it wasn't just one person. It was the sound of heavy footsteps, several officers, flooding into the house. You're not going anywhere, one of the officers barked. Harris's heart pounded as he realized something terrible was unfolding before him. The truth about the Lambert family was more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. And as the officers moved in, Harris understood that this case wasn't nearly over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The room erupted into chaos as the officers rushed into the Lambert household. Harris instinctively stepped forward, trying to control the situation, but there was no time for subtlety now. Emily was frozen, her eyes darting between Jake, the officers, and her parents, who seemed just as bewildered by the sudden intrusion. Step back, everyone! One of the officers barked, her voice sharp as she approached Emily. We're taking her back into custody. No, you don't understand, Jake shouted, pushing forward as though he could somehow block their path. She's trying to tell you the truth. There's more to this. You have to listen to her. But the officers weren't listening. They had orders, and they were acting fast. Emily's arms were grabbed firmly, and she was pulled toward the door. Let her go, Harris commanded, stepping between Jake and the officers. His voice was calm but firm, his eyes locked on the officer who had a hold of Emily. She's not going anywhere just yet. I need her to explain something. The officer hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking to the others, then back to Harris. After a brief pause, she released her grip on Emily's arm but kept a watchful eye on her. What's going on here, detective? One of the officers asked. You're saying there's more to this? Harris turned to face Emily, his eyes narrowing. She was trembling, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. He could sense that she was on the verge of breaking, that there was something she needed to say, something that might change everything. But what could be worse than what she had already confessed? Emily, Harris said gently, trying to keep his voice steady, you said there was more. What is it? What is it that we don't know yet? The room went deathly silent as all eyes were on her. Emily's gaze flickered around, her chest heaving as if she was struggling to find the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It's about my father. Daniel. He knew what happened that night. He knew everything. Harris's pulse quickened. Emily's confession was already shocking enough, but this new claim was something he hadn't expected. Could Daniel have been involved in the cover-up? Had he known the truth all along? What do you mean, Daniel knew everything? Harris asked, his voice laced with urgency. Emily's eyes were wide, and her hands trembled as she tried to explain. It wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one who started the fire. It was supposed to be a plan to fix things. My father, he wanted to protect the family. He thought if we got rid of everything, if we just erased the truth, everything would be fine. But the fire, it wasn't supposed to get out of hand. We didn't mean for it to kill anyone. The room seemed to tilt as the gravity of Emily's words hit Harris. Daniel? Was Emily claiming her father had been involved? Had this been a joint decision, a twisted plan to protect the family at any cost? Jake stepped forward, his face flushed with a mix of anger and frustration. You have to listen to her. They're not telling you everything. Daniel wasn't just involved. He made sure the truth was buried. It wasn't just a secret about Emily anymore. It was about everything. Jake, stop. Sarah suddenly burst out, her voice cracking with panic. She was clutching her hands together tightly, her eyes darting between the officers, Emily, and Daniel. This is not the time, but Emily interrupted her. Her voice, although shaky, was firm now. No, Mom. It's time. It's time for all of you to understand what really happened. Harris's mind raced. He had thought he was starting to piece together the story. Emily had confessed to the murder of Grace, admitting her role in it. But now, this new revelation, the involvement of her father, was turning everything on its head. He needed to know more. Daniel, Harris said slowly, his voice steady, is this true? Were you involved in the fire? In the cover-up? The silence in the room was suffocating. Daniel's face turned pale, his lips trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. His eyes flicked to his wife, Sarah, and then to Emily, as if searching for an escape. But there was no way out now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he admitted. I was involved. We all were. I helped cover it up. Harris's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this admission, but now everything was starting to make sense. The fire had been no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to erase something, to protect the family from a darker truth. But why? What had been so horrible that they had been willing to sacrifice so much to keep it hidden? What did you think you were protecting? Harris asked, his voice harsh now, his frustration evident. What did you do that was so bad you couldn't let anyone find out? Daniel's eyes filled with regret, and he seemed to shrink under Harris's gaze. It wasn't supposed to be like this. We never meant for it to go so far. But it wasn't just Emily who started the fire. It was both of us. We wanted to destroy everything that could tie us to the past. The past? What was Daniel talking about? Harris could feel the pieces slipping into place, but he couldn't see the full picture yet. We were in debt, Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Big debt. And there were people who knew about the fire. People who had been paid off to keep quiet. But when Grace started digging, she became a problem. She knew too much, and I knew if she found out everything, it would all unravel. Harris's mind raced as the weight of Daniel's words sank in. They hadn't just been trying to protect Emily. They had been protecting themselves and the entire family. The fire, the cover-up, the lies. It had all been about erasing something far worse. But that wasn't the end of it. Emily's next words hit like a bombshell. There's more, Emily whispered, her voice trembling with a new kind of fear. It's not just the fire. It's the people we've hurt, the things we've done. Before anyone could react, the sound of distant sirens grew louder, echoing through the streets outside. Harris's stomach turned. This wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The officers outside were only the beginning of what was about to unfold. And as the sirens drew closer, Harris knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming next, it was going to shake the Lambert family and the entire town to its core. The sirens outside grew louder and closer, filling the quiet room with a sense of impending doom. The officers in the living room stiffened, glancing toward the windows, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Harris, however, remained calm, though the tension in the air was suffocating. He had been around long enough to know that when things escalated this quickly, there was no turning back. "Emily, what is this about?" Harris asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. "What else is there? What are you talking about with these people you've hurt?" Emily's eyes darted around the room, as if she were searching for an escape, but there was no way out. She was surrounded, and Harris could sense the walls closing in on her. Her breaths were shallow and quick, as if she were drowning in a sea of her own guilt. Emily started, her voice trembling. "They're not just anyone. They're people from my father's past. People who were involved in things we shouldn't have been." Harris's mind raced as he tried to make sense of her cryptic words. "Involved in what, Emily? What kind of things are we talking about here?" But before Emily could respond, the front door slammed open once more, and another figure stepped into the room. This time, it was someone Harris didn't expect to see. Jack Marlowe, a former associate of Daniel Lambert's who had disappeared years ago after being implicated in a string of shady business deals, stood in the doorway. His unkempt appearance and cold, calculating expression immediately made the hairs on the back of Harris's neck stand on end. Jack had been involved in the family's business years ago, and his sudden appearance now could only mean one thing. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. "Detective Harris," Jack greeted him with a sly grin, stepping further into the room. "I see we're all getting a little too comfortable with the truth, aren't we?" The officers in the room immediately tensed, their hands resting on their holsters, ready for anything. Harris, however, remained focused, his gaze fixed on Jack. "What are you doing here, Marlowe?" Harris demanded, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "You're supposed to be long gone. What do you know about this family's past?" Jack's eyes flicked to Daniel, then to Sarah and Emily, his grin widening. "Oh, I know plenty. The Lamberts and I have a history, you could say. A history that none of you have fully uncovered yet." Harris took a step forward, narrowing his eyes. "What are you implying?" Jack chuckled darkly, leaning against the doorframe with a cocky ease that made Harris want to punch him. "I'm implying that Emily's confession isn't the half of it. What she's telling you, what Daniel's been hiding, it's nothing compared to the things I know. Things that could ruin all of you." Emily's face paled as she turned toward Jack. "No, Jack, don't. Please." But Jack only smirked, enjoying the power he held over her. "Oh, it's too late for that. You've already started unraveling the truth, and now it's time to finish what you started." Harris could feel the walls closing in even tighter now. Jack was dangerous, and if he knew anything about the Lambert family's past, he could be the missing piece to the puzzle that could finally bring everything to light. But at what cost? "What is it that you know, Marlowe?" Harris pressed, trying to keep his cool. "What are you threatening them with?" Jack's grin never faltered as he straightened up, his eyes gleaming with malice. "I know all about the shady business deals Daniel was involved in. The laundering, the threats, the people who were silenced. The Lamberts weren't just trying to protect Emily. They were trying to protect themselves. And when Grace started asking the wrong questions, they had no choice but to deal with her." The words hit like a thunderclap. Harris's mind spun as Jack's words sunk in. The fire, the cover-up, the murder. It wasn't just about Emily or Grace. It was about something much bigger, something darker. Daniel Lambert wasn't just protecting his family from a scandal. He was trying to protect himself from a past that had come back to haunt him. "You're lying," Daniel spat, his face twisted with rage. "None of this is true." But Jack simply laughed, unfazed by the accusation. "You've been hiding it for years, Daniel. Hiding it from your wife, from your daughter, from everyone. But you can't escape the past. Not now." Harris felt his heart race as the pieces began to fall into place. The Lamberts hadn't just been trying to hide Emily's crime. They had been trying to bury an entire history of corruption of dealings with dangerous people who wouldn't hesitate to expose the family if they felt threatened. And when Grace had started digging, she had unwittingly stepped into a world of secrets that the Lamberts would go to any lengths to protect. Enough! Sarah suddenly cried, her voice breaking. She stood up from the couch, her hands shaking as she looked at her husband. Daniel, you have to tell them the truth. It's the only way. Daniel's face twisted in anguish, but he remained silent. It was clear he was battling with himself, but he couldn't deny the truth any longer. The past was catching up with him, with all of them. Jack turned his gaze back to Harris, his smile widening. You're starting to understand now, aren't you, detective? This isn't just about one murder. This is about a whole family's legacy. A legacy that's built on lies, corruption, and blood. Harris's mind raced. There was no denying the depth of the web he was untangling. The fire, the murder, the cover-up. It was all part of something much larger. The Lamberts weren't just a family trying to protect a daughter. They were a family desperately trying to protect their entire legacy from being destroyed. Emily looked up at Harris, her voice barely a whisper. You don't understand. Grace didn't just want to expose me. She wanted to expose everything. She knew about the deals, the people my father worked with. She was going to tell the police everything. And then, her voice cracked, and she choked back a sob. And then they would come for us. All of us. Harris felt the weight of her words, and the pieces finally clicked into place. Grace had been more than just a victim of a jealous sister. She had been a threat to the entire family. And when she threatened to expose them, the Lamberts had done whatever it took to silence her. But now, it wasn't just about one murder. It was about a family's darkest secrets, and everything they had done to keep those secrets buried. Tell me everything, Daniel, Harris said, his voice low and demanding. Tell me about the deals. About the people you were protecting. Or this is all going to come crashing down. And when it does, there will be no way out. The tension in the room was unbearable. Everything had led to this moment. The truth was finally on the verge of being exposed, but at what cost? The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, and Harris knew that whatever happened next, the Lamberts' carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The sound of sirens grew deafening, filling the quiet house with the heavy weight of inevitable change. Daniel Lambert stood frozen, his face pale and filled with regret, while Emily's trembling form was still the focal point of Harris's attention. Jack Marlowe, standing off to the side, watched with a satisfied smirk, knowing the chaos he had helped set in motion was about to reach its terrifying peak. Harris took a deep breath, his mind working overtime to piece together the web of lies, corruption, and murder that had plagued the Lambert family for years. It was no longer just about Emily's confession or Grace's murder. It was about a deep, dark history, one that spanned decades. Daniel had tried to bury his past, but no amount of wealth or power could keep the truth hidden forever. Daniel, Harris said, his voice unwavering, this is your last chance. Tell me everything, or the whole world will know the truth. You've already lost Emily. Don't lose everything else. Sarah, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, now looked up, tears in her eyes. Daniel, please. It's time to end this. We can't keep running. Daniel, looking as if the weight of the world had finally crushed him, looked from his wife to his daughter and then to Harris. For a long moment, he said nothing, his face locked in a battle between guilt and fear. Then, with a slow, resigned sigh, he spoke. It wasn't just the fire, detective. There were people, dangerous people. And when Grace started digging, we knew it was only a matter of time before she uncovered everything. She was going to expose us, me, my business dealings, the debts, the cover-ups, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let my family suffer because of what I did. Harris listened intently, piecing together the truth. Daniel had been involved in money laundering, shady business deals, and even blackmailing influential figures to cover up their past crimes. The fire had been set to destroy evidence, and when Grace found out, she had been silenced, murdered, by her own sister, all to protect their dark legacy. And Jake? Harris asked, turning to the man who had been silently watching the unfolding drama. Jake, still standing in the corner of the room, finally spoke up, his voice low. "I knew about the deals. I knew Grace had started putting the pieces together, but I didn't want to be a part of it. I just wanted to help Emily. I loved her, and I couldn't watch her go down for something she didn't fully understand. But the truth was, the family had so many secrets, I didn't know where to begin." Harris nodded, absorbing the final pieces of the puzzle. The Lamberts weren't just protecting Emily. They had been protecting themselves from a lifetime of lies and criminal dealings. They had murdered Grace to ensure their empire of secrets would never be exposed. And now, they were about to lose it all. Just then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house. Several uniformed officers burst into the room, followed by a few detectives, including one Harris recognized, Detective Anderson, an old colleague. Anderson quickly assessed the situation, his eyes shifting between the family members and the gathered officers. "Detective Harris," Anderson said, his tone serious. "We've got the evidence. The fire was arson, and there's more. Documents, witnesses, and financial trails leading directly to Daniel Lambert. It's all here." Harris glanced back at Daniel, who had slumped into a chair, his face contorted with shame and defeat. There was no more running now. The walls had closed in, and the truth had caught up with him. "And Emily?" Anderson asked, eyeing the young woman who had been at the center of it all. "She's been complicit," Harris replied, his voice stern but sympathetic. "But she was also a victim, manipulated by her family. She'll face charges, but I'll make sure her role is understood." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She looked from Harris to her parents, her voice a hollow whisper. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to protect them. I didn't know. I didn't know how deep it all went." Sarah, who had been quietly sobbing by Daniel's side, reached out to Emily. "It's over now, honey. It's over." But for Daniel and his family, it was only just beginning. The police were already beginning the process of arresting the family members involved. Starting with Daniel, the Lamberts were about to face the consequences of their actions, consequences they had spent years avoiding. As the officers led Daniel away in handcuffs, Emily's gaze lingered on him, her expression empty. She had been a part of something dark, something that had ruined so many lives, including her own. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were no simple answers to the years of lies, pain, and betrayal that had torn her family apart. But there was one thing Emily did know. She had a chance to start over, to rebuild her life, far from the shadows of the past. As Harris watched the scene unfold, he felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. The case was closed, but the damage done would leave scars that would last a lifetime. The Lamberts would never be the same, and neither would the small town they had once controlled. The truth had come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. For Harris, the case was over. But the questions that lingered, the consequences of what had happened, would stay with him forever. What could drive a family to murder to protect their secrets? And what was the true cost of keeping those secrets buried? As the Lamberts were led away, and the officers cleared the house, Harris looked out the window, his gaze heavy. He knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined.